Most of you know that Mariah and I used to have a little dachshund named Hildegard. One of the things that Hildegard had was a big basket of toys. Because she would get toys on her adoption day, and she would get toys on Christmas, and she would get toys just sometimes as a treat. And no matter how many toys she always had one toy that was for playing with. The others were just for having. She always had this favorite toy. This is one of them. I think this is the last one that we ever got her. A little slipper that squeaks. She would chew on these. She would shake these. She would play tug with these. She would play fetch with these. She would just carry it around and sometimes drop it in her water bowl. And over time, these slippers, which we bought one after another because they were her favorite, would get torn apart. They would get holes along the seam that would get stitched up. Sometimes she would get the squeaker out or puncture it so it would make just this sad wheezing noise. And over time, and this one you can barely see it on, there would be this ring that would match her mouth that was kind of discolored and crusty, and you didn't really want to touch it. And eventually, Mariah or I would say, it's time for a new slipper. We should probably get rid of that old one, but Hildegard did not care. Hildegard loved her slipper. She loved her favorite toy, and she would have played with it until it became a biohazard for the entire community. Hildegard, as all dogs do, knew something about love. That part of love, whether it's love for a thing or for a person, is loving that thing or that person exactly how they are. We've been going through the book of Revelation for a little while now, and we're almost at the end. Next week we will hit the final bit of this book. So we've seen a lot. At the beginning we saw how Jesus introduces Revelation, introduces our guide, John, to what is going on, and we were reminded that this is the Jesus who we know. Not some new guy who is different from the Jesus of the Gospels, the Jesus who we encounter in prayer, the Jesus who we encounter in worship. Then we were told to expect a lion to usher in the end of the world, and instead we saw a lamb who had been slaughtered. The Jesus who we know, coming to bring the world to its end. Then we were told about a small group of people who would be saved from the destruction to come. And we saw a multitude that could not be counted. Then we saw destruction, and we saw how that was paused. We learned that revenge fantasies do not come true in God's reign of love. God has something bigger planned. We saw John be told to measure a temple that wasn't there. We saw a great battle between the powers of sin and death and everything that makes life less, and Christ. And as much as we were told that this would be violent and terrible, we saw that what defeated the powers of sin and death and everything that makes life less was not some version of redemptive violence, but the gospel. The gospel makes everything new. And now we are here. The powers of sin and death and everything that makes life less are defeated. They are gone forever. And the book has been opened, and it is time to see who will step into God's reign of love and who will be cast into a lake of fire, a final judgment to judge everything. I need to take control of the slides for just a moment. This is what was read to us today. And anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. And there are questions that this raises. What is the lake of fire? Is that punishment forever? Is that annihilation? Is it destruction? But more importantly, who are these anyones whose names are not found written in the book of life? See, I have been told that this is a book. I have been told that there are names written. I have been told that there are people who step into God's reign of love and people who go into the lake of fire. I have regularly been told that I am going to the lake of fire. And you know that I come down pretty hard on the side of universalism. I come down pretty hard on the side that everyone steps into God's reign of love. And so the question arises, how is Pastor Chris going to wriggle his way out of this very clear statement that some people go into God's reign of love and other people go into a lake of fire? And I'm going to wriggle out of this by pointing out, this is not what the Greek says. Every so often, I get to nerd out. This is what the Greek says. Don't worry if you can't read it. We're going to start with declensions of first nouns. No. The key word here is a little word that just turned purple. That little tease. I could, I'm not going to try right now. This little tease, it is an indefinite pronoun. It means stuff. Any. One. Just like we might use in English. Are there any? We don't know what it's referring to. Now, in English, we tend to make it either about people, anybody, or things, anything. But in Greek, you don't have to do that. It just sits there. It could very well mean, and if the name of anyone is not found in the book of life, but it could also mean if the name of anything is not found in the book of life. And that is an important distinction. That is an important question. That is a question that determines whether the gospel that we preach is good news or bad news. And what determines how we answer that question, how we make that translation, how we make that choice, is our answer to this question. Does God hate sin more than God loves you? Is God willing to throw out everything that you are, everything that makes you you, every bit and piece of you that God loves, because there is just even one speck of detritus left behind by the powers of sin and death and everything that makes life less? Does God look at you and see the tears and the rips and the weird, crusty, discolored ring and the sad wheeze of your soul, and say, I would rather get rid of the whole thing than keep this person who I love. And I will tell you that, to me, the answer to that question has to be, of course not. What kind of madness is that? How crazy would that be? For God to hate the bad bits more than God loves the good bits. God, after all, is love. God, after all, set aside glory and came into the world as one of us among a dispossessed people living in an occupied land. God lived a life we cannot live. God loved a love we cannot love. God took every wound we threw when God was on the cross. God breathed a final breath and was laid in a tomb. God went to the depths of the earth, into the graves, into Hades, and preached the gospel to those who were imprisoned there. And then God got up and stepped out of the tomb into a garden and said, I am not done with you yet. And God did all of that for the sake of the creation that God created, that God loves, that God redeems and restores and repairs. How could God possibly, after all of that and more, throw any of us away? What kind of God would that be? And so I choose to believe that that little word, that little indefinite pronoun, that little tease is not about anyone, but about anything. That God looks at me with love. That God judges me with compassion. That God sees the bits inside of me. That the powers of sin and death and everything that makes life less, who lie defeated on the ground, have left behind, and takes them out, and casts them into fire to be destroyed, and makes me whole again. Maybe even makes me holy again. God restores my soul. And God, I believe, does that for all of us. That the end of the world is not the destruction of the world, but the fulfillment of God's promises to the world, the completion of God's creation of the world, the the bearing of the fruits of everything that God has planted in the world, the blossoming of God's reign of love. And that is good news. But part of love, and an important part of love, is loving what we love and who we love exactly as they are. And it is loving what and who we love too much to leave them as they are. We are, all of us, broken. We are, all of us, stained. We are, all of us, messed up and carrying around the stuff of sin and death and everything that makes life less. We are, all of us, in need of help, in need of repair, in need of liberation, in need of redemption. And that is hard. That is hard. That can even be painful. Because, let's face it, sometimes I love the things that the powers of sin and death and everything that makes life less have left in me. Sometimes I love the things that I should not love. Sometimes I cherish parts of me I should not cherish. Sometimes I revel in the bits of me that I am not proud of. And to have those taken out would hurt, would be painful, would in the moment be sad, even if in the long term it made me better. It made me more myself. It made me more what God intends for me to be. And so this is to say, I don't necessarily want to wait until the final judgment to have those pieces taken out and cast into fire. I don't necessarily want to wait for the final judgment to have those pieces of me, those bits that are not me, those parts that have been left behind by the powers that I do not love, burnt out of me. There is work to do now. There is restoration to happen now. There is reparation to happen now. There is liberation to happen now. There is salvation to happen now. And it will go on. And it is not an easy path. But I have faith. I have trust in the God who is love, who will carry me through that, who will carry you through that, who will carry all of creation through that, who will tend to us with compassion until all things are made new and whole and holy. And so I am willing to do the work, because in the end, I will abide in God's reign of love with all of creation, with everyone, everywhere. And we together will be one people, united in love forever. Thanks be to God.